inundated that it fills up your world, and you can't find a place to get a view on all of it and realize that you are so distracted and figure out what to do about it. It can just colonize your entire world, he said. You are left so depleted that you don't get the space to push back against it. I left James' apartment and walked the streets of the Russian capital, and I began to wonder if there is, in fact, a fourth form of attention. I would call it our stadium lights. It's our ability to see each other, to hear each other, and to work together to formulate and fight for collective goals. I could see a creepy example of what happens when this is lost unfolding all around me. I was in Moscow in winter, and people were walking around outside in t-shirts because it was so warm. A heat wave was just starting in Siberia, a sentence I never thought I would write. The climate crisis couldn't be clearer. Moscow itself, 10 years before, had been choked by the smoke from severe wildfires, but there is very little climate activism in Russia, nor, given the scale of the crisis, anywhere in the world. Our attention is occupied with other, less important things. I knew I was more guilty in this than most. I thought about my own horrendous carbon emissions. Cảm ơn mọi người rất nhiều. Mình uống nước. Các bạn nhớ follow mình nhé. Cảm ơn mọi người. Các bạn nhớ thả tim cho mình nha. Thank you. As I flew back to London, I felt like on this long journey I had learned a huge amount about attention, and I felt I could fix mine a little, step by step. When I landed, I noticed that everyone who worked at the airport was now wearing a mask, and the newspaper stands were full of images of hospitals in Italy where people were dying on the floor or in the corridors. I didn't know it then, but these were the last day before air travel all but ceased across the world. Soon after, Heathrow would be empty and echoing. A few days later, I was walking home when I noticed that my teeth were chattering. It was a mild winter in London too, and I assumed I was caught in a cold draught. But by the time I got home, half an hour later, I was shivering and shaking. I crawled into bed, and I didn't get out again, except to go to the bathroom. For 3 weeks, I had a raging temperature, and I became feverish and almost delusional. By the time I was able to understand what was going on, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson was appearing on television telling everyone that they must not leave their homes, and then, soon after, he was in hospital himself, almost dead. It was like a stress dream where the walls of reality start to collapse. Cảm ơn mọi người rất nhiều. Nếu mà mọi người thích đọc sách như thế này thì nhớ follow mình nhá, và có thể chia sẻ cái livestream này giúp mình nha. Thank you so much. Và nhớ thả tim giúp mình nữa nhá. Thank you. Up to this point, I had been applying what I learned on this journey steadily, step by step, to improve my own attention. I make 6 big changes in my life. 1. I used pre-commitment to stop switching tasks so much. Pre-commitment is when you realize that if you want to change your behavior, you have to take steps now that will lock in that desire and make it harder for you to crack later. One key step for me was buying a case safe, which, as I mentioned briefly before, is a large plastic safe with a removable lid. You put your phone in it, put the lid back on, and turn the dial at the top for however long you want, from 15 minutes to 2 weeks, and then it locks your phone away for as long as you selected. Before I went on this journey, my use of it was patchy. Now I use it every day without exception, and that buys me long stretches of focus. I also use on my laptop a program called Freedom, which cuts it off from the internet for as long as I select. As I write this sentence, it's counting down from 3 hours. 2. I have changed the way I respond to my own sense of distraction. I used to reproach myself and say, "You're lazy, you're not good enough, what's wrong with you?" I try to shame myself into focusing harder. Now, based on what Mihaly something taught me, Instead, I have a very different conversation with myself. I ask, what could you do to get into a flow state and access your mind's own ability to focus deeply? I remember what Mihaly taught me are the main components of flow, and I say to myself, what would be something meaningful to me that I could do now? What is at the edge of my abilities? How can I do something that matches these criteria now? Seeking out flow, I learned, is far more effective than self-punishing shame. 3. Based on what I learned about the way social media is designed to hack our attention spans, I now take 6 months of the year totally off it. This time is divided into chunks, usually of a few weeks. To make sure I stick to it, I always announce publicly when I am going off. I tweet that I am leaving the site for a certain amount of time, so that I will feel like a fool if I suddenly crack and go back a week later. I also get my friend Lizzie to change my passports. 4. Cảm ơn mọi người rất nhiều. Mọi người nhớ thả tim và gì nhỉ? Và follow mình nha. Ở cái điện thoại này của mình hôm nay sao nó cứ bị sao nhỉ? Không như bình thường. 4. I acted on what I learned about the importance of mind wandering. I realized that letting your mind wander is not a crumbling of attention, but in fact a crucial form of attention in its own right. It is when you let your mind drift away from your immediate surroundings that it starts to think over the past and starts to game out the future and makes connections between different things you have learned. Now I make it a point to go for a walk for an hour every day without my phone or anything else that could distract me. I let my thoughts float and find unexpected connections. I found that precisely because I give my attention space to roam, my thinking is sharper and I have better ideas. 5. I used to see sleep as a luxury, or worse, as an enemy. Now I am strict with myself about getting 8 hours every night. I have a little ritual where I make myself unwind. I don't look at screens for 2 hours before I go to bed, and I light a scented candle and try to set aside the stresses of the day. I bought a Fitbit device to measure my sleep, and if I get less than 8 hours, I make myself go back to bed. This made a really big difference. 6. I'm not a parent, but I'm very involved in the lives of my godchildren and my young relatives. I used to spend a lot of my time with them deliberately doing things, busy educational activities I would plan out in advance. Now, I spend most of my time with them just playing freely or letting them play on their own without being managed or over-supervised or imprisoned. I had learned that the more free play they get, the more sound a foundation they will have for their focus and attention. I try to give them as much of that as I can. I would like to be able to tell you that I also did other things I learned I should do to improve my focus, cut out processed foods, meditate every day, build in other slow practices like yoga, and take an extra day off work each week. The truth is I struggle with this. So much of how I deal with ordinary anxieties is tied up with comfort eating and overworking. But I would estimate that by making these 6 changes, I had, by the time I went to Moscow, improved my own focus by about 15 to 20%, which is a fair whack. It made a real and marked difference to my life. All of these changes are worth trying, and there will probably be other tweaks to your life that you are considering based on what you've learned, what you've read in this book. I am strongly in favor of individuals making the changes they can in their personal lives. I am also in favor of being honest about the fact there are limits to how far that can take you. Cảm ơn các bạn nhớ thả tim và follow mình nhé. Mình sẽ đọc thêm các cuốn sách tiếng Anh khác nữa trong tương lai, và mình cũng làm rất nhiều nội dung tiếng Anh trong cái trang Facebook, trang TikTok của mình. Các bạn có thể vào ủng hộ mình nha. Cảm ơn các bạn rất là nhiều. Ôi, sắp hết quyển này rồi. Trời ơi. As I was recovering from COVID-19, I found myself in a weird mirror image of where I started this journey. I began by going to Provincetown for 3 months to escape the internet and cell phones. Now I was shut away for 3 months in my apartment with almost nothing but the internet and cell phones. Provincetown had liberated my focus and attention. The COVID-19 crisis brought it lower than it had ever been. For months, I couldn't focus on anything. I skipped from news channel to news channel, seeing fear and fever spread across the world. I took to spending hours listlessly watching live webcams of all the places I had been to research to this book. I had been I had been to research this book. It didn't matter where they were, Venice or Marboni, Fifth Avenue in New York or Commercial Street in Provincetown. They were all the same. The streets were almost empty except for short sightings of mass people squattering. I was not alone in finding it impossible to focus. Some of what I experienced was likely a biological after effect of the virus, but many people who hadn't been infected were reporting a similar problem. There was a 300% increase in people Googling how to get your brain to focus. All over social media, people were saying they couldn't get their mind to work. But now I felt I had the tools to understand why this was happening to us. Your individual efforts to improve your attention can be dwarfed by an environment full of things that wreck it. This has been true for years leading up to COVID-19, and it was even more true during it. Stress shatters attention, and we were all more stressed. There was a virus we couldn't see and didn't fully understand, and it was threatening all of us. The economy was tanking, and many of us were suddenly even more financially insecure. On top of this, our political leaders often seemed dangerously incompetent, which ramped up the streets further. For all these reasons, many of us were suddenly hyper-vigilant. And how did we cope? We turned more heavily than ever before to our Silicon Valley-controlled screens, which were waiting for us, offering connection or at least a hologram of it. As we used them more, our attention seemed to get worse. In the US, in April 2020, the average citizen spent 13 hours a day looking at a screen. The number of children looking at screens for more than 6 hours a day increased sixfold, and traffic to kids' apps trebled. In this respect, COVID gave us a glimpse of the future we were already skidding towards. My friend Naomi Klein, a political writer who has made many strikingly accurate predictions about the future for 20 years, explained to me we were on a gradual slide into a world in which every one of our relationships was mediated by platforms and screens, and because of COVID, that gradual process went into hyperspeed. The tech companies were planning for us to be immersed in their world to such an extreme extent that in a decade's time, not now, the plan was not for it to leap in this way. She said that leaping is an opportunity, really, because when you do something that quickly, it comes as a shock to your system. We didn't slowly acclimatize to it and get hooked on its increasing patterns of reinforcements. Instead, we got slammed headfirst into a vision of the future, and we realized we hate it. It's not good for our well-being. We desperately miss each other. Under COVID, even more than before, we were living in stimulations of social life, not the real thing. It was better than nothing, to be sure, but it felt thinner, and all the while the algorithms of surveillance capitalism were all telling us, checking and changing us for many more hours a day. Cảm ơn mọi người rất nhiều, mọi người nhớ thả tim giúp mình nhá. Thank you. Và nhớ follow mình nha, mình uống ngụm nước. Các bạn có câu hỏi gì thì comment nhé. Lát nữa mình sẽ đọc, mình đang đọc cuốn sách Stolen Focus của tác giả Johan Hari nha. Đây là chỗ mua sách nhé các bạn. Các bạn có thể chụp lại màn hình nhé. Ok. Mình đọc tiếp nhá. Quên mất đọc đến đâu rồi. Ôi trên chết rồi, mình đọc đến đâu rồi? À đây. I could see that in the pandemic, the environment changed and this wrecked our ability to focus. For many of us, the pandemic didn't create new factors that ruined our attention. It supercharged the factors that had already been corroding our attention for years. I saw this when I talked with my godson Adam. Ôi giời ơi, cái cây chống điện thoại này nó cùi bắp quá này. Đợi mình đi, nó bị làm sao ấy. Phải mua cái mới thôi. Mọi người ơi, các bạn nhớ thả tim cho mình nhá, cho cái livestream nó lên, cho nó lên xíu nữa. It supercharged the factors that had already been corroding our attention for years. I saw this when I talked with my godson Adam, who I had taken to Memphis. His attention, which had been deteriorating for some time, was now shattered. He was on his phone almost every waking hour, seeing the world mainly through TikTok, a new app which made Snapchat look like a Harry James novel. Nami told me that the way we felt when we were spending all day in lockdown on Zoom and Facebook was awful, but also kind of a gift because it showed us the road we were headed down with such clarity. More screens, more stress, more collapse of the middle class, more insecurity for the working class, more invasive technology. She called this vision of the future the Green New Deal. She told me the ray of hope in all of this is that we are in touch with how much we dislike this vision of the future, that we have just trial run. We weren't going to have a trial run. We were going to have a gradual roll out, but we got a crash course. One thing was now very clear to me. If we continue to be a society of people who are severely underslept and overworked, who switch tasks every 3 minutes, who are tracked and monitored by social media sites designed to figure out our weaknesses and manipulate them to make us scroll and scroll and scroll, who are so stressed that we become hypervigilant, who eat diets that cause our energy to spike and crash, who are breathing in a chemical soup of brain-inflaming toxins every day, then, yes, we will continue to be a society with serious attention problems, but there is an alternative. It's to organize and fight back, to take on the forces that are setting fire to our attention and replace them with forces that will help us to heal. I started thinking about why we need to do this with an analogy that seemed to tie together a lot of what I had learned. Imagine you bought a plant and you wanted to have it grow. What would you do? You would make sure certain things were present, sunlight and water and soil with the right nutrients, and you would protect it from the things that could damage or kill it. You would plant it far from the trampling feet of other people and from pests and diseases. Your ability to develop deep focus is, I have come to believe, like a plant, to grow and flourish to its full potential. Your focus needs certain things to be present: play for children and flow states for adults, to read books, to discover meaningful activities that you want to focus on, to have space to let your mind wander so you can make sense of your life, to exercise, to sleep properly, to eat nutritious food that makes it possible for you to develop a healthy brain and to have a sense of safety. And there are certain things you need to protect your attention from because they will sicken or stunt it. Too much speed, too much switching, too much stimuli, intrusive technology designed to hack and hook you, stress, exhaustion, processed food pumped with dyes that amp you up, polluted air. For a long time, we took our attention for granted, as if it was a cactus that would grow in even the most desiccated climate. Now we know it's more like an orchid, a plant that requires great care or it will wither. With this image in mind, I now have a sense of what a movement to reclaim our attention might look like. I would start with 3 big, bold goals. 1. ban surveillance capitalism because people who are being hacked and deliberately hooked can't focus. 2. Introduce a 4-day week because people who are chronically exhausted can't pay attention. 3. Rebuild childhood around letting kids play freely in their neighborhoods and at school because the children who are imprisoned in their homes won't be able to develop a healthy ability to pay attention. If we achieve these goals, the ability of people to pay attention would, over time, dramatically improve. Then we will have a solid core of focus that we could use to take the fight further and deeper. Gì đấy các bạn? Đấy, mình giơ cái tên sách ra đây rồi gì? Chỗ mua đây gì? Bạn tìm trên Facebook rồi ra ngay mà. Chết nhầm. Đây. Mua ở đây ạ. Ở đây ạ. Mọi người chụp màn hình lại ạ. The idea of building a movement sometimes seemed to me still quite hard to picture concretely, so I wanted to talk to people who had built movements around really big, impossible seeming goals and actually achieved them. My friend Ben Stewart was the lead of communications at Greenpeace UK for years, and when I first met him more than 15 years ago, he told me about a plan he was drawing up with other environmentalist activists. He explained that Britain was the birthplace of the environmentalist activists. He explained that Britain was the birthplace of the industrial and any other fuel to global warming. His team were drawing up a plan to force the government to end all new coal mines and new power station in Britain and move rapidly to leaving all the country's existing coal in the world, in the ground to ensure it will never be burned. When he explained it, I literally laughed out loud. Good luck to you, I said. I'm on your side, but you are being a dreamer. Within 5 years, every single new coal mine and new coal power plant in Britain was stopped, and the government had been forced to set in stone plans to close down all the ones that already existed. As a result of their campaign, the place that launched the world on the road to global warming had begun to seek out a path beyond it. I wanted to talk to Ben about our attention crisis and how we could learn from other movements that have succeeded in the past. He said, I agree with you, it's a crisis. It's a crisis for the human species, but I don't think it's being identified like that in the same way that structural racism or climate change are. I don't think we're at that point yet. I don't think that it's understood that it's a societal problem and that it's caused by decisions by corporate actors and that it can change. So Ben told me the very first step to building a movement is to create a consciousness-raising breakthrough cultural moment where people go, shit, my brain's being frazzled by this stuff. It's why I don't have some of the pleasures in life I used to have. How do we do that? The ideal tool, he said, is what he calls a side battle. This is where you choose a place that symbolizes the wider struggle and begin a non-violent fight there. An obvious example is Rosa Parks taking her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Think, he said, about how we did it with coal. Man-made global warming is a rapidly unfolding disaster, but like our attention crisis, it can easily seem pretty abstract and far away and hard to get a handle on. Even once you understand it, it can seem so huge and overwhelming that you are often left feeling powerless to do anything. When Ben first drew up his plans, there was a coal-fired power station in Britain named King's North, and the government was planning to authorize the construction of another coal station right next to it. This, Ben realized, was the whole global problem in microcosm. So after a lot of planning with his allies, he broke into the power station and abseiled down its side, painting a warning about the extreme weather events that coal unleashes across the world onto the side of the building. They were all arrested and put on trial, which was part of their plan. They intended to use their justice process in a jitsu move as the perfect opportunity to cut coal itself on trial. They called some of the leading scientific experts from all over the world to testify, to explain what the burning of coal is doing to the ecosystem. In Britain, there's a law that says that in an emergency, you can break some rules. You don't get charged with trespassing, for example, if you break into a burning building to save people. Ben and his legal team argued that this was an emergency. They were trying to prevent the planet being set on fire. 12 ordinary British rulers considered the facts, and they acquitted, I'm not sure how this word is pronounced, Ben and the other activists on all counts. It was a sensational story, reported all over the world. In the wake of the negative publicity around coal that emerged out of the trial, the British government abandoned all plans to build new coal-powered stations and began to shuttle the ones that remain. Cảm ơn mọi người rất nhiều. Mọi người comment gì thì cứ comment nhé, là mình sẽ đọc nha. Mọi người nhớ thả tim giúp mình nhá. Và nhớ follow mình để theo dõi các cuốn sách khác. Vì cuốn sách này mình sắp đọc xong rồi mọi người ạ. Lại uống nước. So, Ben asked, should people be surrounding Facebook, HQ, Twitter? What's the side battle here? What's the issue we start on? This is something activists need to debate and decide on. As I write this, I know one group is considering projecting a video of Holocaust survivors talking about the dangers of supercharging far-right ideas onto the side of Facebook's HQ. Ben stressed that side battles alone don't deliver victory. What they do is establish the crisis clearly in the public's mind and draw more people into a movement so they can begin to fight at many different levels and in many different ways. On attention, Ben said, a side battle is an opportunity to explain to people this is a fight about personal liberation, about liberating ourselves from the people who are controlling our minds without our consent. There is something that people can coalesce around, and it's highly motivating as well. That then becomes a movement millions of people can join. Their participation after that will take many forms. Some of it will be inside the political system, organizing within political parties or lobbying the government. Some of it will continue to be outside the political system, with direct action and persuading other citizens. To succeed, you need both. As I talked with Ben, I wondered if a movement to achieve these goals should be named Attention Rebellion. He smiled when I suggested it. It is an attention rebellion, he said. I realize this requires a shift in how we think about ourselves. We are not medieval peasants begging at the courts of King Zuckerberg for scums of attention. We are the free citizens of democracies, and we own our own minds and our society, and together we are going to take them back. At times, it seemed to me that this would be a hard movement to get off the ground, but then I remember that all the movements that have changed your life and my life were hard to get off the ground. For example, when gay people first started organizing in the 1890s, they could be put in prison just for saying who they loved. When labor unions started fighting for the weekend, they were beaten by the police and their leaders were shot or hanged. What we face is, in many ways, vastly less challenging than the cliff they had to scale. They didn't give up. Often, when a person argues for social change, they are called naive. The exact opposite is the truth. It's naive to think we as citizens can do nothing and leave the powerful to do whatever they want, and somehow our attention will survive. There's nothing naive about believing that concerted democratic campaigning can change the world. As the anthropologist Margaret Mead said, it's the only thing that ever has. I realize that we have to decide now Do we value attention and focus? Does being able to think deeply matter to us? Do we want it for our children? If we do, then we have to fight for it. As one political said, you don't get what you don't fight for. Even as it became clearer to me what we need to do now, there were some unresolved thoughts that kept nagging at me. Lying beneath so many of the causes of this crisis that I had learned about, there seemed to be one big cause, but I was reluctant to reckon with it because it is so big, and to be honest, I hesitate to write about it now in case it daunts you too. Back in Denmark, Sun Lin Man had shown me the evidence that the world is speeding up and that process is shrinking our collective attention span. He showed that social media is a major accelerant, but he made it clear that this has been happening for a very long time. His study started analyzing data from the 1990s, and it showed that every decade since, the way we experience the world has been getting faster, and we have been focusing on any topic less and less. I kept puzzling away at this question. Why? Why has this been happening so long? This trend far precedes Facebook on most of the factors I have written about here. What's the underlying cause, stretching back to the 1990s? I discussed it with many people, and the most persuasive answer came from the Norwegian scientist Thomas Helen Erichsen, who is a professor of social anthropology. Ever since the Industrial Revolution, he said, our economies have been built around a new and radical idea, economic growth. This is the belief that every year the economy and each individual company in it should get bigger and bigger. That's how we now define success. If a country's economy grows, its politicians are likely to be re-elected. If a company grows, its CEOs are likely garlanded. If a country's economy or a company's share price shrinks, politicians or CEOs face a greater risk of being booted out. Economic growth is the central organizing principle of our society. It is at the heart of how we see the world. Thomas explained that growth can happen in one of two ways. The first is that a corporation can find new markets by inventing something new or exporting something to a part of the world that doesn't have it yet. The second is that a corporation can persuade existing consumers to consume more. If you can get people to eat more or to sleep less, then you have found a source of economic growth. Mostly, he believes, we achieve growth today primarily through this second option,